Deep in the mountains of West Virginia, a single mother named Sarah Martinez thought she had found salvation in the most unlikely place. Drowning in debt and desperate to give her young daughter a roof over their heads, she paid $1 for what no one else wanted, an abandoned Cold War bunker that had been sealed and forgotten for over 40 years. The realtor called it a fool's bargain, a concrete tomb that would swallow what little she had left, but Sarah had nothing left to lose. On her first night inside, armed with only a dying flashlight, she discovered a massive steel door hidden behind a crumbling false wall. When she finally forced it open, her breath caught in her throat. Stacked floor to ceiling in the vault were hundreds of gold bars, their surfaces gleaming in the darkness like a dragon's hoard. Who had hidden $420 million in this forgotten place? And what deadly price would she pay now that she had found their secret? The air in the McDowell County Courthouse Annex was thick with the smell of damp wool, stale coffee, and the bitter scent of desperation that clung to every foreclosure auction like a shroud. Sarah Martinez sat rigidly on a hard wooden bench near the back, her 7-year-old daughter Emma pressed close against her side, the child's small hand gripping her mother's with an intensity that broke Sarah's heart. At 32, Sarah looked older, her face drawn and pale, dark circles under her eyes testifying to months of sleepless nights spent calculating impossible math, trying to stretch $247 into rent, food, medicine, and hope. The medical bills from Emma's illness, a severe pneumonia that had hospitalized her for 2 weeks, had devoured everything. Their savings, their apartment deposit, and finally their ability to stay in the small rental they'd called home. She had come to this auction not with any real plan, but with the last gasping desperation of a mother who would try anything, anything at all, to keep her daughter safe and sheltered. The auctioneer, a weathered man in his 60s with a voice like gravel, moved through the list with practiced monotony. A repossessed pickup truck that went for $800, a set of commercial kitchen equipment that sparked brief interest, a small house on the edge of town that sold to a local contractor. Sarah barely heard any of it, her mind churning through the same impossible equations, until the auctioneer's tone changed, flattening into something that sounded almost apologetic. He cleared his throat and announced the next item with obvious reluctance: Parcel 47B, an abandoned Cold War-era bunker facility built into Copperhead Mountain, complete with 15 acres of wooded land. The structure sealed since 1981, condition unknown, sold as is with no warranty or guarantee, and the buyer would assume 14 years of back property taxes totaling $3,847 due within 90 days. The room, which had been humming with low conversations and rustling papers, fell into an eerie, profound silence. Sarah felt the shift immediately, a collective intake of breath, a sudden stillness that felt less like quiet and more like the pause before something terrible. She looked around and saw the faces of the local residents, farmers and contractors and speculators who had been actively bidding moments before, now staring straight ahead or down at their laps. Deliberately avoiding eye contact with the auctioneer, an elderly woman in the front row actually made a small sign of the cross. The auctioneer waited, his eyes scanning the room with a grim resignation that suggested he already knew what would happen. He announced the opening bid would be $1, a price so absurdly low it could only mean one thing: no one wanted this property at any cost. The silence stretched, becoming uncomfortable, oppressive. Sarah's mind raced, her heart suddenly pounding. $1 for land and shelter. Even a damaged bunker was a roof, a place Emma could be safe and warm, and she had 90 days to figure out the taxes, 90 days to find work, to rebuild. Before she could talk herself out of it, before rational thought could override desperate maternal instinct, her hand shot up, her voice surprisingly steady as she called out, $1. Every head in the room turned to stare at her, and what she saw in their faces was not anger or competition, but something far worse. Pity, deep and profound, the kind reserved for those who have just made a terrible, irrevocable mistake. The auctioneer's gavel came down with a sound like a gunshot, his voice heavy with an emotion she couldn't name as he declared, "Sold to the lady in the back for $1. God help you." The only hardware store in the small town of Bramwell was a weathered building that looked like it had been standing since the coal boom days, its wooden sign reading, Hutchins Hardware Est. 1,952, in faded paint that was peeling in long curling strips. Sarah pushed through the door, the bell above it giving a tired chime. Emma trailing behind her with the wide, uncertain eyes of a child who had learned too young that the world was not always a safe place. Inside, the store smelled of sawdust, machine oil, and old wood, the aisles narrow and crammed with tools and supplies that looked like they'd been on the shelves for decades. Behind the counter stood an elderly man, easily in his 70s, with a weathered face that spoke of a lifetime in these mountains and pale blue eyes that were sharp and assessing beneath bushy white eyebrows. He watched Sarah approach with a basket of bare essentials, a flashlight, batteries, a box of large trash bags, work gloves, and a cheap padlock. His expression was polite and helpful until she handed him the deed as identification for her purchase, and when he read the property description, his face went pale, the paper trembling slightly in his gnarled, work-worn hands. He was Walter Brennan, as his name tag indicated, and he set the deed down on the scarred wooden counter, as if it had burned him. When he spoke, his voice was low and urgent, the jovial shopkeeper persona vanishing entirely. He told her the story in careful, measured words, the way a man speaks when he's trying very hard to be believed. The bunker had been built in 1962 during the Cuban Missile Crisis, but it had been purchased in 1979 by a reclusive millionaire named Victor Castellane, a mysterious figure who had arrived in West Virginia with more money than sense, and a paranoia that seemed, in hindsight, almost justified. Victor had lived there alone for nearly 2 years, rarely coming to town, always paying in cash, asking no favors and offering no friendship except to Walter, who had been one of the few people the strange man would talk to. Then in the winter of 1981, Victor simply vanished. His car was still parked at the bunker, his supplies still stocked, as if he'd stepped out for a walk and never returned. Walter's weathered hands gripped the counter as he continued, his voice dropping even lower. The property had gone to auction the first time in 1985, bought by a real estate developer who lasted 3 weeks before abandoning it after federal agents showed up asking questions about permits and previous owners. The second owner, a doomsday prepper who thought he'd found paradise, left after 2 weeks, his face white with terror, refusing to say what he'd experienced. The third owner, a corporation wanting to use it for secure storage, walked away after their lawyers were visited by other lawyers representing unnamed interests who made increasingly aggressive buyout offers. The fourth owner, a young contractor, experienced a series of strange accidents, his equipment failing, small fires, his brakes giving out on the mountain road. The fifth owner, just 3 years ago, was a family from Pittsburgh who lasted 11 days before fleeing in the middle of the night, leaving all their possessions behind. Walter leaned across the counter, his pale blue eyes holding Sarah's with an intensity that made her deeply uncomfortable. He told her that strange men in expensive suits had come through town over the years, asking questions about the bunker, about Victor, about who owned it now. Corporate lawyers had tried multiple times to purchase it through intermediaries, offering absurd amounts of money for what should have been worthless property. Something was in that bunker, or something had happened there, that powerful people wanted to keep buried. His voice was barely above a whisper when he delivered his final warning, his gnarled hand reaching across to touch hers with surprising gentleness. "Some places are left alone for a reason, miss. That bunker has swallowed 5 owners in 40 years. Whatever you paid for it, whatever you're hoping to find there, it's not worth your life or that little girl's safety. Please, I'm begging you, walk away while you still can." The sun was already sinking behind the jagged peaks of the Appalachian Mountains when Sarah's old Honda Civic, its check engine light a constant companion, rattled up the overgrown dirt road that led to what was now, impossibly, her property. Emma sat in the passenger seat, her small face pressed against the window, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and exhausted curiosity. The road, barely more than 2 ruts carved into the mountainside, climbed steeply through dense forest of oak and pine, the trees pressing in on both sides like sentinels guarding a secret. Then the forest opened into a small clearing, and Sarah's breath caught in her throat. The bunker was not what she had imagined. It was massive, a brutalist concrete structure built directly into the face of the mountain, its surface stained with decades of rust and water damage, thick vines of kudzu and wild grape climbing across it like nature trying desperately to hide what man had created. The entrance was a rectangular opening, perhaps 10 feet high and 8 feet wide, framed by steel-reinforced concrete that had weathered to a mottled gray-brown. The heavy steel door, easily 6 inches thick and mounted on enormous hinges, stood partially ajar, a gap of darkness beckoning like a mouth frozen mid-scream. Sarah killed the engine, and the silence that descended was profound, broken only by the whisper of wind through the pines and the distant call of a crow. Emma reached for her mother's hand, her small fingers cold and trembling. Sarah forced herself to smile, to project a confidence she absolutely did not feel, and said in her brightest voice that this was an adventure, that they were pioneers, that everything was going to be okay. They approached the entrance slowly, Sarah carrying their 2 sleeping bags, a lantern, and a plastic grocery bag with bread, peanut butter, and 2 bottles of water. The steel door was far heavier than it looked, and Sarah had to put her shoulder against it to widen the gap enough for them to slip through. The air that rushed out was stale and cold, carrying the scent of concrete, rust, and something else, something organic and faintly unpleasant that Sarah tried not to think about. Inside, the main corridor stretched into absolute darkness, swallowing the beam of Sarah's cheap flashlight after only 20 feet. The walls were bare concrete, sweating with moisture, and the floor was covered in a thick layer of dust, disturbed only by the tracks of small animals. Doors lined both sides of the corridor, most of them standing open to reveal small empty rooms that might have been sleeping quarters or storage. The ceiling was low, perhaps 7 feet, lined with conduit and pipes that had long since gone silent. Emma stayed pressed against Sarah's leg, her breathing quick and shallow, her small hand gripping her mother's jacket with white-knuckled intensity. They explored cautiously, Sarah's flashlight beam cutting through the oppressive darkness, revealing room after room of abandonment, metal bed frames with no mattresses, empty shelving units, a bathroom with fixtures that were rusted beyond use, a larger room that might have been a common area with a table bolted to the floor. Finally, they found a room that seemed less damaged than the others, a small chamber, perhaps 10 by 12 feet, with a door that still closed properly and a ventilation grate that, when Sarah held her hand beneath it, produced a faint, cool breeze suggesting the system still functioned, at least partially. She laid out their sleeping bags on the concrete floor, made peanut butter sandwiches by lantern light, and told Emma a story about brave princesses who lived in castles made of stone. Emma fell asleep clutching her worn stuffed rabbit, her small body curled tight against the cold. Sarah lay awake in the darkness, listening to the strange sounds of the bunker settling around them, the distant drip of water, the groan of metal contracting in the night air, the scurry of small creatures in the walls. The concrete beneath her was unforgiving, cold seeping through the thin sleeping bag and into her bones. She stared up at the invisible ceiling, her mind racing through everything Walter had told her, through all the warnings and the pity in the auctioneer's eyes, and she wondered with a sinking, nauseating certainty if she had just made the worst, most dangerous mistake of her life, if her desperation to save her daughter had instead delivered them both into something far worse than homelessness. Morning came slowly to the bunker, not with sunlight but with a gradual lessening of the absolute darkness, a gray pallor seeping through the partially open entrance door that served as their only connection to the outside world. Sarah woke stiff and cold, every muscle in her body protesting the night spent on concrete, but Emma was still sleeping, her small face peaceful in a way it hadn't been in months, and that alone made the discomfort worthwhile. She let her daughter sleep and decided to use the quiet hours to explore more of their new home, to take inventory of what they had and what challenges lay ahead. She left Emma in the small room they'd claimed, the door open so she could hear if her daughter woke, and ventured deeper into the bunker's main corridor with her flashlight and the crowbar she'd purchased from Walter's hardware store. The bunker was larger than she'd realized, the main corridor stretching back at least 100 feet before branching into side passages. Most of the rooms were empty, stripped bare decades ago, but she found what appeared to have been a storage area near the back, a larger space, perhaps 20 feet square, with metal shelving units still bolted to the walls. The floor here was cleaner, less disturbed, as if this room had been sealed off or simply forgotten. Sarah played her flashlight beam across the walls, looking for damage, for structural issues, for anything that might make this place livable, and that's when she noticed it, a section of the back wall that looked different. The concrete was the same color, the same texture, but there was something about it that struck her as wrong, as too uniform, too perfect compared to the weathered, water-stained surfaces around it. She approached slowly, running her hand across the surface, and it felt smooth, almost like it had been painted or sealed. On impulse, she rapped her knuckles against it, and the sound that came back was not the solid thud of concrete against mountain stone, but a hollow echo, a resonance that spoke of empty space beyond. Her heart began to beat faster, that peculiar mixture of fear and excitement that comes with discovering something hidden. She took the crowbar and tapped it gently against different sections of the wall, listening carefully, and the entire section, perhaps 8 feet wide and 7 feet tall, rang hollow. This was not a solid wall. This was a facade, a false front hiding something behind it. She wedged the flat end of the crowbar into a barely visible seam near the edge and pulled. At first, nothing happened, but then she felt something give, a slight shift, and she repositioned her grip and pulled harder. With a grinding crack, a section of the concrete facing broke away, and beneath it she saw not more concrete, but a steel frame. Industrial gray metal that had been carefully covered to look like part of the original structure. Sarah's hands were shaking now as she worked the crowbar into the gap, prying away more of the false concrete, large chunks of it falling to the floor and shattering into dust and fragments. Within 20 minutes she had cleared enough to reveal the truth. Behind the false wall was a narrow corridor, perhaps 3 feet wide, leading deeper into the mountain. The walls of this hidden passage were smooth steel, and at the far end, barely visible in the throw of her flashlight beam, was a door unlike anything else in the bunker. It was massive, circular, the kind of vault door Sarah had only seen in movies about bank heists or nuclear facilities. It was made of brushed steel that had dulled with age but showed no rust, its surface marked with a complex locking mechanism of wheels and bolts that looked like something from a submarine. Sarah's breath came in short, shallow gasps as she squeezed through the gap she'd made and approached the vault door, her flashlight beam dancing across its surface. The lock mechanism, an intimidating array of steel pins and rotating wheels, appeared broken, pieces of it hanging loose, and most incredibly, impossibly, the door itself was not fully closed. There was a gap, perhaps 2 inches wide, where the massive door had been left slightly ajar, as if someone had opened it in a hurry and never had the chance to seal it again. Sarah placed both hands on the cold steel surface of the vault door and pulled with every ounce of strength she possessed, her feet bracing against the smooth floor of the hidden corridor, her muscles screaming with the effort. For a long moment, nothing happened. The massive door as immovable as the mountain itself. But then she felt it shift, just slightly, the ancient hinges groaning in protest after decades of stillness. She repositioned her grip and pulled again, harder this time, and slowly, ponderously, the door began to swing open, revealing a widening slice of absolute darkness beyond. A breath of air rushed out to meet her, and it was not the stale, dead coldness of the rest of the bunker, but something else entirely, cool, clean, and carrying the faint mechanical hum of active systems. Sarah's flashlight beam cut into the darkness, and what it revealed made her freeze in place, her mind struggling to process what her eyes were seeing. The chamber beyond was perhaps 30 feet square, the walls lined with the same brushed steel as the corridor, and overhead she could see vents and what looked like climate control equipment. Lights on control panels, blinking steadily in the darkness. Impossible evidence that after 40 years this room still had power. But it was not the technology that stole her breath and made her heart hammer against her ribs like a trapped bird. It was what filled the room. Arranged on heavy-duty industrial shelving that lined 3 of the 4 walls were stacks of metal bars, each one approximately 12 inches long, 4 inches wide, and perhaps 2 inches thick, their surfaces gleaming dully in her flashlight beam with the unmistakable warm luster of gold. Sarah stepped into the vault on legs that felt disconnected from her body, her hand reaching out to touch the nearest bar, and it was cold and impossibly heavy as she lifted it, turning it over to reveal a stamp pressed into its surface, a Swiss refinery mark she recognized from a documentary she'd once watched, the weight notation of 400 troy ounces, and a date, 1979. She set it down carefully and moved deeper into the chamber, her flashlight beam sweeping across row after row of identical bars, stacked 5 high, 10 deep, shelf after shelf of them. Her mind, trained by years of working as a hospital billing clerk, began automatically calculating even as her hands shook, if each bar was 400 ounces, and gold was currently trading at around $1,900 per ounce. That meant each bar was worth roughly $760,000, and there were hundreds of them, easily 300 visible just on the shelves she could see. The numbers spiraled in her head, becoming almost incomprehensible. 200 million, 300 million, perhaps more. This was not money. This was a fortune beyond anything she had ever imagined. the kind of wealth that existed only in news reports about billionaires and nations. Sarah's legs gave out, and she sank to the floor of the vault, her back against the cold steel wall, her flashlight clattering beside her as her whole body began to tremble uncontrollably. Against the far wall, she noticed two other objects that had escaped her initial attention. A heavy filing cabinet made of the same industrial gray metal as everything else, secured with a substantial padlock, and beside it, resting on a small table, a leather-bound journal, its cover worn and water-stained. She crawled forward and picked up the journal with shaking hands, opening it to the first page, and there, in neat, precise handwriting, were the words, "My name is Victor Castellane. If you are reading this, then I am already dead, and you have found what they killed me for." Sarah sat in the cold fluorescent silence of the vault, surrounded by more wealth than most people would see in 100 lifetimes, her 7-year-old daughter sleeping innocently in a room down the corridor, and she realized with a clarity that was almost painful that her life had just changed forever, split decisively into before and after this moment. But she had no idea whether she had just been saved or damned. Sarah sat on the cold steel floor of the vault, her back pressed against the wall, the leather journal open in her lap, and read Victor Castellane's words by the beam of her flashlight, each page pulling her deeper into a story that was equal parts confession, warning, and desperate plea. The handwriting was neat and precise, the script of an educated man, an accountant trained to track numbers and find patterns where others saw only chaos. Victor had written methodically, dating each entry, organizing his thoughts with the same discipline he had once applied to corporate ledgers, and what emerged was the portrait of a man who had stumbled onto a truth so terrible it had cost him everything. He began by explaining who he had been, a senior accountant for Apex International, a massive conglomerate based in New York, with tentacles reaching into defense contracting, pharmaceuticals, real estate, and a dozen other industries, a company whose annual revenue exceeded the GDP of small nations. For 15 years, he had been a loyal employee, rising through the ranks, earning the trust of the executives, gaining access to files and accounts that few others ever saw. Then in early 1979, while conducting a routine audit of a subsidiary's overseas operations, he had noticed something wrong, money flowing in patterns that made no sense. Enormous sums moving through shell companies in the Cayman Islands, disappearing into accounts that had no legitimate business purpose, then reappearing as assets that were never properly documented. He had done what accountants do. He had followed the numbers, traced the transactions, reconstructed the hidden architecture of the money, and what he discovered had shattered his world. Apex International was not just a legitimate corporation. It was a massive criminal enterprise disguised in expensive suits and corporate letterhead. They were laundering hundreds of millions of dollars from illegal arms sales to embargoed nations, from partnerships with drug cartels moving cocaine through Central America, from bribes paid to senators and congressmen and federal judges to secure contracts and kill investigations. The journal detailed it all with devastating precision: dates, amounts, account numbers, the names of executives who had signed off on the transactions, the names of politicians who had taken the money. Victor had documented everything, photocopied thousands of pages of evidence, and then he had made his move. In the summer of 1979, he had discovered something even more damaging, a slush fund of physical gold bars, $400 million worth, purchased with laundered money and stored in a secure facility in Switzerland, meant to be gradually sold off and funneled into offshore accounts where it could never be traced. The gold was the heart of their operation, the reserve that backed their criminal empire, and Victor had realized it was also his leverage. He had used his access and his knowledge of their systems to orchestrate an impossible theft, redirecting the shipment, using forged documents and bribed officials, moving the gold from Switzerland to a private freight company to a series of trucks that drove it across the country to West Virginia, to this bunker that he had purchased and prepared in secret. His plan had been simple: hold the gold as ransom, force Apex to meet with federal investigators, use the threat of exposure to guarantee his safety, and ensure the evidence he had gathered would see the light of day. But something had gone wrong. The journal's entries grew more frantic, more paranoid, filled with references to men following him, to phone calls in the middle of the night, to the growing certainty that Apex had no intention of negotiating, that they had decided it was easier to kill him and search for the gold forever than to risk the truth coming out. The final entry, dated the 15th of December 1981, was written in a shaking hand that suggested Victor had known his time was running out. I have taken their treasure. Now they must listen. If you are reading this, I am likely dead. The gold is blood money, stolen from drugs and weapons and corruption. Use it to finish what I started. Make them pay for what they have done. Sarah spent the rest of that first morning in a daze, carefully returning the journal to its place in the vault, closing the massive door as much as she could without the working lock mechanism, and reconstructing the false wall as best as possible using the broken concrete pieces and some old tarps she found to cover the gap. Emma woke asking for breakfast, and Sarah made her peanut butter sandwiches with hands that still trembled, her mind a whirlwind of impossible thoughts about gold and dead men and blood money and what any of it meant for their future. By noon, she knew they needed supplies, real food, cleaning materials, warmer blankets, and she needed to think, to process what she had found in a place that was not this buried tomb of secrets. She loaded Emma into the car and drove back down the rutted dirt road toward town, and that was when she first noticed it. On the ridge across the valley, perhaps half a mile away but clearly visible against the gray winter sky, was a vehicle that had not been there the night before, a black SUV, large and expensive-looking even at this distance, parked at an angle that gave it a clear view of the bunker entrance. Sarah slowed her car, studying it through her dusty windshield, and the SUV did not move, did not start its engine, just sat there like a predator watching prey. She continued down the mountain, telling herself it was probably nothing, a hunter or a hiker, but when she checked her rearview mirror 20 minutes later as she turned onto the paved county road, the black SUV was behind her, maintaining a careful distance of perhaps a quarter mile, always keeping at least 2 cars between them when other traffic appeared. Sarah's heart began to pound, but this time it was not panic. It was something else, something older and more disciplined. She had served 4 years in the Army, nothing glamorous, a logistics specialist managing supply chains at Fort Bragg, but the training had included basic security awareness, how to recognize when you were being followed, how to confirm surveillance. She drove into Bramwell and deliberately made a series of turns that no one with an actual destination would make, left into the grocery store parking lot, through it, out the back, right onto Main Street, left onto a side street, back to Main. The black SUV followed each turn, never closing the distance, never falling too far behind, professional and patient. Sarah pulled into the small grocery store and sat in her parked car, watching her mirrors, and the SUV drove past slowly, the windows too darkly tinted to see who was inside, and then it parked 3 blocks away, positioning itself where it could watch the store entrance. Emma asked why they were sitting in the car, and Sarah forced a smile and said she was just making a shopping list, but her mind was racing through possibilities, each one worse than the last. No one should know she had found anything in the bunker. She had told no one, had been alone except for Emma, and yet someone was watching her with professional precision less than 24 hours after she had opened that vault. Either they had been watching the bunker all along, waiting to see if anyone would finally discover what was hidden there, or somehow they knew, had sensors or alerts or informants that told them when the vault had been accessed. She thought of Victor Castellane's journal, his paranoid final entries about being followed, about men in expensive cars, and she realized with cold, creeping dread that whatever had killed him 40 years ago had not gone away, had not given up, had simply been waiting with inhuman patience for someone to finally find what he had hidden. She gathered Emma and went into the store, moving through the aisles with forced casualness, buying bread and milk and canned soup, all while her training screamed at her that she was compromised, that she had been marked, that the watchers knew. Sarah drove back through town with Emma, the black SUV maintaining its careful distance, and she made a decision born of desperation and the growing certainty that she could not face this alone. She pulled up in front of Walter's hardware store, the same shop where she had received her first warning, and this time, when the bell chimed above the door, she walked straight to the counter, where the elderly man was sorting nails into small bins, his weathered hands moving with the practiced efficiency of decades. She waited until the only other customer, a farmer buying chicken wire, had left, and then she leaned across the counter and said in a low, urgent voice that she needed to talk to him about Victor Castelaine, about what was really in that bunker, because someone was following her, and she was terrified and she had nowhere else to turn. Walter's pale blue eyes went wide, and he looked past her through the store's front window to where her car was parked, studying it for a long moment before he flipped the sign on the door to closed, pulled down the shade, and gestured for her to follow him to the small office in the back. He sat her down in a worn chair, gave Emma a lollipop and a coloring book to keep her occupied, and then he told her the truth he had been carrying for 40 years like a stone in his chest. Victor Castellane had not just been a customer, he had been Walter's friend, perhaps his only real friend in those years, a strange, haunted man who had appeared in town in 1979 with enough money to buy the bunker outright and enough fear to never truly sleep peacefully. Victor had confided in Walter over the course of those 2 years, not everything, but enough, that he had worked for powerful people, that he had discovered terrible things, that he had taken something from them as insurance, and that he knew they would eventually come for him. Walter had tried to convince him to go to the police, to the FBI, to anyone who could help, but Victor had insisted that the corruption went too high, that he could not trust anyone in authority, because he did not know how far the rot extended. Then, in December of 1981, Victor had simply vanished. His truck was found at the bunker with the keys still in the ignition, but Victor himself was gone, and no body was ever found. Within days, men in expensive suits arrived in town, claiming to be from Apex International's legal department, saying that Victor had embezzled corporate funds and fled, offering a reward for information about his whereabouts. The local sheriff, a man Walter had never trusted, conducted a cursory investigation and declared it a missing persons case, probably a suicide or an accident in the mountains, and that was the end of it. Walter had always believed Victor was murdered, his body hidden somewhere in the vast wilderness, but he had no proof, no evidence, just the hollow certainty that his friend had been killed for whatever secret he had been protecting. Walter reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a small envelope, yellowed with age, and from it he extracted a tiny brass key, no bigger than the kind that might open a diary or a small padlock. He placed it in Sarah's trembling hand and closed her fingers around it, his weathered grip surprisingly strong, and he said in a voice thick with emotion that Victor had given this to him 3 days before he disappeared, with specific instructions. If anyone ever bought the bunker at auction, fair and square through proper legal channels, not through corporate intimidation or backroom deals, they were to have this key, because Victor believed that only someone truly desperate, someone with nothing to lose, would ever dare to claim that cursed property, and that person might be brave enough to finish what he could not. Sarah waited until after dark to return to the bunker, the black SUV having finally disappeared from her mirrors around sunset, though she had no illusion that she was no longer being watched. Emma was exhausted and fell asleep almost immediately in their makeshift bedroom, clutching her stuffed rabbit, while Sarah took her flashlight and the small brass key Walter had given her and made her way through the darkened corridors to the hidden passage behind the false wall. The vault door groaned as she pulled it open again, the sound echoing through the empty chambers like the cry of something long buried finally allowed to speak. The filing cabinet stood against the far wall where she had seen it before, a squat industrial gray box that looked mundane next to the stacks of gleaming gold. But as she approached it with the small key clutched in her sweating palm, she felt a certainty that whatever was locked inside was somehow more dangerous than all the wealth surrounding her. The key slid into the lock with a smooth click, and the drawer rolled open on well-oiled bearings to reveal contents that had been waiting 40 years for someone to find them. Inside, organized with the meticulous precision of a trained accountant, were dozens of manila folders, each one labeled and dated, creating a comprehensive archive of corporate crime that took Sarah's breath away. The first folder contained photographs, dozens of them, surveillance shots taken with telephoto lenses showing men in expensive suits meeting in parking garages, on boat docks, in the private rooms of exclusive restaurants. Sarah recognized some of the faces from old news reports, executives from Apex International, their names and titles typed on labels affixed to each photo, and across from them, men whose faces she did not know but whose body language screamed violence and criminality. Below each photograph, Victor had attached typed notes identifying the criminals. A Colombian cartel lieutenant, an arms dealer wanted in 6 countries, a money launderer for organized crime. The second folder contained financial documents, copies of bank transfers moving millions of dollars through shell companies with names like Meridian Holdings and Pacific Trade Associates. Each transfer meticulously traced from source to destination, showing money flowing from drug operations and illegal weapons sales into Apex accounts, then being laundered through legitimate businesses and real estate purchases. The third folder held shipping manifests and customs documents, records of crates labeled as agricultural equipment or industrial machinery that actually contained surface-to-air missiles, assault rifles, and plastic explosives, all shipped to embargoed nations and rebel groups, all bearing the forged signatures of Apex logistics officers. The fourth folder was perhaps the most damaging, a leather-bound ledger that looked like something from a Victorian counting house. Its pages filled with neat handwritten entries documenting 20 years of systematic bribery. Each entry listed a name. Sarah recognized senators and congressmen and federal judges, a dollar amount, and a service rendered, a vote on a defense appropriations bill, a blocked investigation, a favorable ruling in a regulatory dispute. It was a complete map of corruption reaching into the highest levels of government, proof that Apex had not just broken laws but had systematically purchased the very people meant to enforce those laws. At the bottom of the drawer, Sarah found one more document that made her blood run cold. A single typed page titled Material Witnesses, listing 37 names of people who had worked for Apex or its subsidiaries, people who had seen too much, known too much. Next to each name was a date, and with growing horror, Sarah realized these were not hire dates or birth dates, but death dates. A roster of the dead and disappeared spanning from 1,975 to 1,980. Each one marked with clinical precision, an accounting of murder rendered in the same neat columns Victor had once used to track quarterly earnings. Sarah had just finished reading the witness list for the third time, committing names to memory, when she heard the sound of a car engine approaching the bunker, the rumble echoing through the concrete corridors in a way that made her freeze. It was mid-morning, 2 days after her conversation with Walter, and Emma was in their room drawing pictures with the crayons Sarah had bought in town. Sarah moved quickly to the entrance, her heart pounding, and saw a sleek silver Mercedes sedan, completely out of place on the rutted mountain road, pulling to a stop in the clearing. The driver's door opened, and a woman stepped out, and everything about her screamed money and power and danger. She was perhaps 50 years old, tall and slim, dressed in a charcoal gray suit that probably cost more than Sarah's car, her dark hair pulled back in a severe bun, her face professionally made up but cold, her eyes hidden behind expensive sunglasses that she removed as she approached. She walked with the confident stride of someone accustomed to getting exactly what she wanted, her heels somehow navigating the uneven ground without faltering. Sarah met her at the entrance, blocking it with her body, and the woman stopped a respectful distance away and smiled, though the expression never reached her eyes. She introduced herself as Margaret Thorne, legal counsel for Castellane Asset Recovery LLC, which she explained was the successor corporation to certain interests previously held by Apex International, and she had come to discuss a matter of some urgency regarding this property. Her voice was cultured, professional, the kind of voice that gave orders in boardrooms and expected immediate compliance. She said that while Sarah had technically purchased the property through legal channels, there were certain complications, certain prior claims dating back decades, that gave her clients legal ownership of not just the land, but all contents and structures thereon. She suggested they could avoid lengthy and expensive litigation if they came to a simple arrangement right now. From a leather briefcase, she produced a document and a bank envelope, setting them on the hood of her Mercedes. The envelope, she explained, contained $100,000 in cash, more than enough to purchase a proper home for Sarah and her daughter somewhere far from West Virginia. And the document was a simple release form and non-disclosure agreement, stating that Sarah had found nothing of value on the property and relinquished all claims. It was, Margaret said with that cold smile, an extraordinarily generous offer for a bunker Sarah had paid $1 to acquire. Sarah looked at the envelope, thick with bills, and for just a moment she felt the pull of it, the temptation to take the money and run, to escape this nightmare before it consumed her. But then she thought of Victor Castellane's journal, of his desperate final words, of the list of 37 people who had taken money or believed promises and ended up dead, and she heard herself say, her voice surprisingly steady, that she was not interested in selling. The change in Margaret Thorne was instantaneous and terrifying. The professional facade cracked like ice, and beneath it was something reptilian and merciless. She placed the documents back in her briefcase with precise, controlled movements, and when she spoke again, her voice had lost all pretense of warmth. She said that Sarah was making a serious mistake. that her clients had invested considerable resources over many years in securing their interests, and they did not respond well to obstruction from people who did not understand the situation they were in. She took a step closer, and Sarah could smell her perfume, expensive and cloying, as Margaret looked past her toward the bunker entrance and said with deliberate emphasis that she understood Sarah had a daughter, a beautiful 7-year-old girl named Emma, and it would be such a tragedy if this situation became complicated, if people started asking questions about Sarah's fitness as a mother, or worse, if accidents happened, because mountains were dangerous places and children were so fragile. The threat was not veiled, it was crystal clear, delivered with the casual cruelty of someone who had made such threats before and followed through. The nightmares started on the third night after Margaret Thorne's visit, Emma waking with a scream that tore through the concrete corridors like a siren, her small body rigid with terror, her eyes wide and unseeing even as Sarah gathered her into her arms and rocked her, whispering reassurances into her sweat-dampened hair. Emma sobbed that there was a man in the hallway, a sad man with kind eyes who was trying to tell her something, and Sarah, exhausted and frayed, told her daughter it was just a bad dream, that the bunker was old and strange and their minds were playing tricks on them. But the nightmares continued, night after night, and Emma became increasingly insistent that the man was real, that he wore old-fashioned clothes and had a gentle smile but such sadness in his face, and he kept appearing in the corridors pointing at the walls, trying to show her something important. Sarah, caught between rational disbelief and the growing unease that seemed to permeate every shadow in this place, tried everything, leaving lights on, telling happy stories before bed, even sleeping with Emma curled against her in the single sleeping bag, but nothing stopped the dreams. On the 6th night, Emma woke not screaming but calm, eerily so, and she told Sarah in a small, certain voice that the sad man wanted them to look in a specific place, that he had shown her exactly where, and she could take Sarah there if she would just trust her. Sarah, desperate for anything that might end these nightmares and give her daughter peace, agreed, and in the gray light of early morning, Emma led her through the bunker's main corridor, past the rooms they had explored, past the storage area where Sarah had found the vault, to a section of hallway they had barely examined because it appeared to dead end at a solid concrete wall. Emma stopped in front of a section of wall that looked identical to every other section, bare concrete marked with decades of water stains and the scratches of small animals. And she placed her small hand flat against it and said with absolute conviction that the sad man had pointed here, had stood right in this spot, and pointed with both hands. Sarah, skeptical but unwilling to dismiss her daughter's certainty, examined the wall closely, running her hands over its surface, and at first she found nothing. But then her fingers caught on something, a slight irregularity in the texture, a seam so fine it was almost invisible. She pressed against the concrete, and a section of it, perhaps 3 feet square, shifted slightly inward with a grinding sound that made Emma jump. It was not a false wall like the one hiding the vault, but rather a removable panel, a piece of concrete mounted on a hidden frame that could be taken out if you knew it was there. Sarah worked her fingers into the gap and pulled, and the panel came free, revealing a shallow alcove carved into the wall behind, a space no more than a foot deep but carefully constructed and hidden. Inside the alcove, wrapped in a plastic garbage bag that had yellowed with age but still protected its contents, was a black VHS tape in a plastic case. And taped to the case was a label written in Victor Castellane's now familiar precise handwriting that read simply, "Insurance 1981. Sarah lifted the tape out with trembling hands, staring at it as if it were a bomb, which in a way it was, and Emma tugged at her sleeve and asked if the sad man was happy now, if they had found what he wanted them to find. And Sarah looked down at her daughter's innocent face and realized with a chill that settled deep in her bones that Emma had been led to this by something, whether ghost or intuition or the strange energy of this place where a good man had died defending the truth, and that whatever was recorded on this tape was important enough that Victor had hidden it separately from everything else, a final, desperate ace in the hole that he had preserved for someone brave or foolish enough to need it. Sarah knew she could not watch the tape in the bunker, could not risk anyone who might be watching the property, seeing light or hearing sound from inside, so she drove to the next town over, a slightly larger place called Welch, and found a thrift store that smelled of mothballs and old books where she purchased for $30 a boxy television set from the 1990 seconds, and a VCR that the clerk promised still worked. She set up the equipment in their small room in the bunker after Emma had fallen asleep, using a blanket hung over the doorway to block any light from escaping into the corridor. And with hands that shook so badly she could barely manage it, she inserted the tape and pressed play. The screen flickered with static, then resolved into an image that made Sarah's breath catch. Victor Castellane, alive and moving, sitting in what she recognized as this very vault, the gold bars visible on shelves behind him. He was younger than she had imagined, perhaps 45, with dark hair going gray at the temples, a lean face that might have been handsome under different circumstances. But what struck her most were his eyes, sunken and haunted, the eyes of a man who had not slept peacefully in months and knew he never would again. He wore a simple button-down shirt, and his hands, clasped on the table in front of him, trembled slightly as he began to speak directly to the camera in a voice that was surprisingly calm, despite the fear that radiated from every line of his body. He identified himself, stated the date as the 10th of December, 1981, and said that he was recording this testimony because he believed he would not live long enough to deliver it in person to any authority that could be trusted. He explained his position at Apex International, his 15 years of loyal service, and how in early 1979 he had been assigned to audit the books of a subsidiary company and had noticed irregularities that led him down a path of discovery that had destroyed his life. He detailed, with an accountant's precision, the money laundering operation, specific account numbers, specific transactions, the names of bank officers who had been bribed to facilitate the transfers. Then his voice grew harder, more urgent, as he described what the money was paying for. Apex's CEO, a man named Richard Drummond, had personally ordered the assassination of a federal investigator who had gotten too close to their defense contracting fraud, and Victor had found the canceled checks paid to the hitman, the internal memos discussing the problem and its solution. He spoke of a senator, whom he named, who had taken $2 million to kill a congressional investigation into Apex's activities, and Victor held up photocopies of the wire transfers and a photograph of the senator meeting with Drummond in what was supposed to be a secret location. Then Victor's hands began to shake more violently, and he described the most terrifying discovery of all: internal documents outlining Apex's plan to expand into biological weapons development, to sell engineered pathogens to the highest bidder regardless of international law or human cost. And he had copies of the preliminary research proposals, the lists of scientists they planned to recruit, the projected profits from selling death itself. Victor's face, gaunt and gray in the harsh light of the vault, filled the screen as he leaned toward the camera, and his voice broke as he said that he had tried to do the right thing, had tried to take this to the FBI, but he had been warned by a sympathetic agent that Apex had people inside the bureau, that he could not know who to trust, so he had taken the gold as leverage, as the one thing they valued enough that they might negotiate rather than simply kill him. His eyes, wet with unshed tears, stared directly into the camera, directly at Sarah across 40 years of silence, and he said in a voice that was barely a whisper, "I don't expect to survive this. They are watching me. They know I have something. But the truth must survive even if I cannot. If you have found this, whoever you are, please, I am begging you, finish what I could not. Make them pay for what they have done. Don't let all these deaths, all these crimes, disappear into silence. You are my last hope. You are the truth's last hope." Sarah woke in the absolute darkness of the bunker to a sound that did not belong, the distant scrape of metal against concrete, and her body went rigid with a fear so primal it bypassed thought entirely. She had been sleeping fitfully, as she had every night since watching Victor's tape, her subconscious always alert for danger, and now every sense screamed that the danger had arrived. She heard it again, closer now, the sound of footsteps, multiple sets, moving with professional stealth through the corridors, and then the unmistakable sound of the false wall being pried open, the concrete fragments falling. They had found the vault. Sarah moved on pure instinct, clamping her hand over Emma's mouth to stifle any sound before her daughter could wake fully and cry out, and she whispered directly into her ear with desperate urgency that they had to hide, had to be absolutely silent, that men were in the bunker and they were in terrible danger. Emma, bless her, seemed to understand immediately, her small body going still and compliant as Sarah gathered her up along with Victor's journal, which she had taken to keeping close at all times. Sarah's mind raced through options, through the layout of the bunker she had memorized over the past week, and then she remembered a passage from Victor's journal she had read days ago, a mention of the ventilation system, of access ducts large enough for maintenance that ran through the walls. She had located the nearest access panel in their exploration, a grill set low in the wall of a storage room 3 doors down from where they slept. She moved through the darkness with Emma in her arms, not daring to use a light, her bare feet silent on the cold concrete, and she could hear the men now in the vault room, their voices low and professional as they conversed. She reached the storage room, found the grill by touch, and her fingers, shaking with adrenaline, worked at the screws that held it in place, screws that mercifully were loose and old. The grill came free with a soft squeal of metal, and Sarah pushed Emma into the dark mouth of the duct, climbing in after her, and pulling the grill back into place, just as she heard footsteps approaching their sleeping room. The duct was barely large enough for her to squeeze through, the metal cold against her skin, but it led horizontally along the wall, and after 10 feet it opened into a larger vertical shaft. And she and Emma huddled there in the absolute darkness, pressed against the cold metal, barely breathing. Through the ventilation grill in the wall below them, Sarah could see the harsh white beams of tactical flashlights sweeping through the corridor, and 2 men came into view. And what she saw made her blood turn to ice. They were professionals, dressed head to toe in black tactical gear, wearing night vision goggles pushed up on their heads now that they were using lights, carrying what looked like military-grade rifles, moving with the practiced coordination of people who had done this kind of work many times before. They were not thieves, they were operators, mercenaries or private security, the kind of people corporations like Apex hired when they needed something done quietly and permanently. She heard one of them, a tall man with a gravelly voice, call out to his partner who was still in the vault room, "Anything?" The response came back, "Gold's here, just like the surveillance suggested. I'm photographing it now. But I don't see any documents, no filing cabinets, nothing." The tall man swore softly and said the old man would have hidden the evidence files separately. Thorne said he was paranoid, methodical. Check the walls, the floor, anywhere that could be a secondary hide. Sarah heard them moving through the vault, tapping on surfaces, and her heart hammered so hard she was certain they would hear it. But Emma remained perfectly still in her arms, understanding with a child's clarity that their lives depended on silence. After what felt like hours but was probably only 15 minutes, the tall man spoke again, his voice carrying frustration. "Nothing. Either it's not here, or it's hidden too well to find in one night. I've got clear photos of the gold. Thorne wants confirmation before committing a full team." The other man emerged from the vault, and Sarah could see him clearly now through the grill, a shorter, stockier figure, and he said, "If it's here, we'll need a full extraction team, equipment to move the gold. And time. This is at least a 2-day operation, maybe 3. The tall man nodded and gestured toward the exit. "Let's report. Thorne will want to move fast now that we have confirmation." Sarah waited until the men's footsteps had faded completely, until she heard the distant sound of a vehicle engine starting and driving away. And then she waited another hour in the cold darkness of the ventilation shaft, her arms wrapped around Emma, before she dared to move. When they finally climbed out, her whole body was shaking, not just from cold but from the crystalline understanding that this was no longer about money or property rights. This was about survival, and she and Emma would not survive if she continued to face this alone. She packed 2 bags in frantic silence, taking only essentials and the most critical documents from the filing cabinet, the ledger, a handful of the most damning photographs, and Victor's journal. She hid the videotape in a new location, wrapped in plastic and buried in a coffee can in the woods behind the bunker, because if something happened to her, someone needed to be able to find it. Then, as dawn broke gray and cold over the mountains, she loaded Emma into the car and drove, not to town but away, onto the interstate, heading north toward Charleston, the state capital. 3 hours of winding mountain roads that she navigated in a state of hyper-alert exhaustion, constantly checking her mirrors for any sign of the black SUV or other followers. Charleston was large enough to disappear in, and she found the main public library, a beautiful old building downtown that smelled of books and floor polish and offered something she desperately needed: anonymity and public internet access. She settled Emma in the children's section with a stack of picture books and a stern warning to stay visible and not talk to strangers, and then she claimed a computer terminal in a quiet corner and began to search. She needed help, but not from local police who might be compromised, not from federal authorities she could not verify, but from someone whose job was to expose exactly the kind of corruption Victor had died fighting. She searched for investigative journalists, for reporters who had taken on powerful corporations and survived to publish their stories. She found several names, but one kept appearing in articles about corporate malfeasance and government corruption. David Chen, a reporter for a major national news organization who had won awards for exposing defense contractor fraud and pharmaceutical company bribery. His articles were thorough, fearless, and most importantly, he was still alive and still publishing, which suggested he knew how to protect himself and his sources. Sarah created a new encrypted email account using a service Victor's journal had mentioned, one that routed messages through multiple servers to hide their origin, and she composed a message to the general tip line email address listed on Chen's articles. She did not explain who she was or where she had gotten the information. She simply attached a single high-resolution photograph she had taken of one page from Victor's ledger, a page that showed a sitting U.S. senator receiving $500,000 in exchange for killing an investigation, complete with account numbers, dates, and Victor's meticulous notations. She hit send and then sat back, her heart pounding, wondering if she had just made a terrible mistake or taken the first step toward salvation. She expected to wait days for a response, if one came at all, but within 45 minutes, a new message appeared in her inbox, and when she opened it with trembling hands, it contained only 2 sentences in plain text. "Where did you get this? We need to talk." Carefully, there was a phone number, a request to use a burner phone, and instructions for setting up a secure communication channel. Sarah sat in the quiet library, surrounded by ordinary people, researching ordinary things, and she realized that she had just made a choice that would determine everything that came next. That David Chen's 2-sentence response meant he recognized what she had sent him, understood its significance, and was willing to risk getting involved, which meant she was no longer alone. Sarah followed David Chen's instructions precisely, purchasing a cheap prepaid phone at a convenience store and calling the number he had provided from a different location, a gas station 20 miles outside Charleston. His voice on the phone was cautious, professional, asking questions designed to verify she was legitimate and not setting a trap. What year was the ledger dated? What was the name of the senator on the page she had photographed? Details only someone who actually possessed the documents would know. Satisfied, he gave her an address, a small diner called Rosie's on the outskirts of the city, and told her to come alone, but to park where she could see the entrance. To wait 15 minutes after arriving to make sure she had not been followed, and only then to come inside. Sarah left Emma with a kind librarian who ran a children's story hour, promising to be back within 2 hours, and she drove to the diner with her stomach twisted in knots, following Chen's security protocols, because they matched what little she remembered from her military training about meeting sources in potentially hostile situations. The diner was exactly the kind of anonymous place you would choose for a clandestine meeting, a tired building with cracked vinyl booths, flickering fluorescent lights, and a handful of truckers and elderly locals who paid no attention to anyone else. David Chen was sitting in the back corner booth, and Sarah recognized him immediately from the author photo on his articles. A man, in his mid-40s, Chinese-American, with sharp, intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, wearing a rumpled button-down shirt and jeans, his dark hair showing threads of premature gray. He looked exhausted, the kind of deep weariness that came from years of fighting battles most people never knew were being waged. But when he saw her approach, his eyes lit with an intensity that was almost frightening. He gestured for her to sit, ordered coffee for both of them from a waitress who looked like she had stopped caring about anything decades ago, and then he leaned across the scarred Formica table and said in a low, urgent voice that she needed to tell him everything from the beginning and leave nothing out. Sarah talked for 30 minutes, her voice barely above a whisper, telling him about the auction, about Walter's warnings, about finding the vault and the gold, and Victor's journal and the filing cabinet, and finally the videotape. She watched Chen's face as she spoke, and she saw the transformation from professional skepticism to barely contained excitement to something darker, a kind of grim validation. When she finished, he sat back against the cracked vinyl of the booth, and his hands, she noticed, were shaking as he lifted his coffee cup. He told her that he had been investigating Apex International and its successor corporations for 6 years, ever since a whistleblower had contacted him with fragments of information about money laundering and illegal arms sales. But the whistleblower had disappeared before providing concrete evidence, and Chen had hit wall after wall, finding hints and traces but never the kind of solid proof that could survive legal challenges from a corporation with unlimited resources. He had published what he could, careful articles that stayed just within the boundaries of what he could prove, and he had made enemies, powerful ones, people who had made it clear through intermediaries that he was dancing on the edge of something that could get him killed. But he had never stopped digging, never stopped hoping that somewhere the evidence existed, and now Sarah was sitting across from him telling him it was real. That Victor Castellane had done what Chen had spent years trying to do. Document everything, create an airtight case, preserve it against time. Chen's voice dropped even lower, and he reached across the table to grip Sarah's hand with surprising strength, his eyes holding hers with desperate intensity as he said, "This could bring down an empire. This is RICO charges, conspiracy, murder, corruption at the highest levels. This is the story I have spent my entire career chasing. But Sarah, you need to understand what you are holding. These people have killed to protect this secret. Victor is dead. His witnesses are dead. They will not stop now. They will come for you with everything they have, and they will not care about legal niceties or collateral damage. If we do this, if we go forward with exposing this, your life as you knew it is over, and there is a very real chance that we both end up dead." David Chen did not sugarcoat the danger, but he also did not counsel surrender. And over the next 3 hours in that dingy diner, drinking cup after cup of bitter coffee while the afternoon light faded outside, he laid out a plan with the methodical precision of someone who had thought deeply about how to survive exposing powerful enemies. He explained that the fundamental problem was that they could not trust the system, could not simply walk into an FBI field office or a U.S. attorney's office and hand over the evidence, because Victor's ledger made it clear that Apex had cultivated sources inside multiple federal agencies, had paid off officials whose job was supposed to be protecting the public, and they had no way of knowing which agents were clean and which were compromised. What they needed, David said, was insurance, multiple layers of it, redundant systems that would ensure the truth came out even if Sarah or David or both of them were killed or silenced. First, they would digitize everything, every page of the ledger, every photograph, every document from the filing cabinet, and critically, Victor's videotape, which David said would need to be converted to a digital format by someone he trusted absolutely. Once digitized, the evidence would be encrypted and copied to multiple secure cloud storage services, each one using different login credentials, each one set up to be accessed by different trusted individuals if something went wrong. David had colleagues, other investigative journalists at major publications across the country, people who had spent years building reputations for integrity and who could not be easily intimidated or bought. He would send encrypted copies to 3 of them with instructions that if he failed to check in with a specific code phrase every 72 hours, they were to publish everything immediately. Second, they would create physical backups, because digital evidence could be hacked or deleted, and corporations like Apex had cyber capabilities that rivaled nation-states. Sarah would rent safety deposit boxes at 3 different banks in 3 different cities, each one containing a complete set of photocopies and a copy of the digitized files on encrypted USB drives. The boxes would be registered under false names, using identification documents that David's sources could provide, and the keys would be held by different people in David's network. Third, and most critically, they would establish what David called a dead man's switch, a system that required active input from Sarah to prevent the evidence from being automatically released. He explained it with the grim practicality of someone who had contemplated his own mortality many times. Sarah would check in with David every single day at a specific time, using a secure messaging app, and she would send a specific code phrase that changed daily according to a prearranged pattern. If she missed 2 consecutive check-ins, or if she sent a duress code indicating she was being coerced, David would immediately trigger the release protocol, sending the evidence to his colleagues, to specific federal investigators he had vetted personally over years of careful assessment, and to major media outlets simultaneously. The idea was that Apex could not kill Sarah or threaten her into silence without guaranteeing their own exposure, that her continued safety became their only rational choice. Finally, David said, they needed to begin the process of identifying the right federal authorities, and he had spent years cultivating relationships with a handful of FBI agents and federal prosecutors who had proven themselves clean, who had turned down bribes and resisted political pressure, and who had the institutional power to bring RICO charges that could destroy an organization like Apex. But approaching them had to be done carefully, with evidence in hand and protective measures already in place, because the moment federal authorities became involved, the situation would escalate dramatically. David looked across the table at Sarah, his expression grave, and he said that this process would take time, perhaps weeks, and during that time she and Emma would be in constant danger, that she should consider sending Emma somewhere safe, to relatives or friends far away, because what was coming would be ugly and ruthless. Sarah felt the weight of it all pressing down on her, the enormity of what she was about to do. But when she thought of Victor Castellane's haunted eyes on that videotape, of his desperate plea to finish what he could not, and of the 37 names on that witness list, 37 people who had been murdered to protect corporate profits, she knew there was no choice at all. Sarah returned to the bunker 3 days after her meeting with David Chen, having digitized all the documents at a secure location he had arranged, having set up the dead man's switch, having done everything they could to protect the evidence, and she felt both safer and more exposed than ever before, knowing that her life was now wired into a system that would explode into public consciousness the moment anything happened to her. Emma was back with her, and Sarah had decided against sending her away because being separated felt more dangerous than staying together, at least for now, and they had fallen into a tense routine of normal activities performed under the constant awareness that they were being watched. It was late afternoon, 4 days after the break-in, when Sarah heard vehicles approaching, not one but two, and she looked out to see Margaret Thorne's silver Mercedes, followed by a large black SUV pulling into the clearing. Margaret emerged first, still impeccably dressed, but this time she was not alone. 4 men climbed out of the SUV, and these were not the tactical operators from the night raid, but rather a different kind of muscle. Large men in suits that did not quite hide the bulk of weapons beneath, the kind of men corporations hired when they wanted to intimidate rather than infiltrate. Sarah stepped out to meet them, positioning herself between the vehicles and the bunker entrance, and Margaret's smile was colder than ever as she announced that she had returned with a revised offer, that circumstances had changed and her clients were now willing to pay $50,000 cash for immediate possession of the property. Take it or leave it. Final offer. Sarah, her heart hammering but her voice steady, said what she had said before. The property was not for sale. Margaret's smile vanished entirely, and she nodded to one of the men, a thick-necked brute with dead eyes, and he moved with shocking speed toward the bunker entrance. Pushing past Sarah before she could react, she heard Emma scream from inside, that high, terrified sound that bypassed all rational thought, and Sarah spun and ran after him, her military training flooding back. 4 years of combatives' instruction and self-defense, suddenly as fresh as yesterday. She caught the man just inside the entrance, his meaty hand already gripping Emma's arm, and Sarah did not think, did not plan, just acted. She drove her elbow into his kidney with all her strength, a strike designed to incapacitate, and as he grunted and turned, she swept his legs, using his own weight and momentum to send him crashing to the concrete floor. Emma broke free and ran deeper into the bunker, while Sarah faced the other 3 men who were now rushing toward her, and she knew with desperate clarity that she could not win this fight, that they would overwhelm her through sheer size and numbers, but she would hurt them, would make them pay for every inch. The first man who reached her swung a fist like a hammer, and she ducked under it and drove her palm into his nose, feeling cartilage crunch, blood exploding across his face. But then the second man grabbed her from behind, his arms wrapping around her in a crushing bear hug that drove the air from her lungs. She was struggling, fighting, her vision starting to gray at the edges, when a voice like thunder cut through the chaos, a voice she recognized. "Let her go, or I will blow you in half." Walter Brennan stood in the entrance, and he was not the gentle old shopkeeper anymore. He was something older and harder. A man who had lived through wars and did not make idle threats, and in his weathered hands was a pump-action shotgun pointed directly at the men, his finger on the trigger, his pale eyes cold as winter. The man holding Sarah released her immediately, stepping back with his hands raised, and Margaret Thorne, for the first time, looked genuinely uncertain, the careful control slipping from her face. Walter did not lower the shotgun as he said in that same gravelly voice that they had 30 seconds to get in their vehicles and leave, and that if he ever saw them on this property again, he would shoot first and call the sheriff after, and there must have been something in his eyes, some absolute conviction, because they went. Margaret paused at her car door, her face twisted with rage, and she said in a voice that dripped venom, "You just chose the hard way, Sarah. We tried to be civilized. Now you will learn what happens to people who stand in the way of progress. Every day from now on will be worse than the last until you break, and you will break. Everyone does. The vehicles roared away, leaving only dust and the ringing silence of aftermath, and Sarah sank to her knees, pulling Emma into her arms, while Walter stood guard with his shotgun, and all three of them understood that the real war had just begun. The accident happened 2 days after Margaret Thorne's threat, on a narrow mountain road that Sarah had driven a dozen times before, the kind of winding 2-lane highway that hugged the mountainside with a steep drop on one side and sheer rock face on the other. Sarah was driving Emma to the library in the next town, trying to maintain some semblance of normal life, when she pressed the brake pedal going into a sharp curve and felt nothing, no resistance, just the pedal sinking uselessly to the floor. Her military training kicked in instantly, her mind going cold and clear even as terror flooded her system. She downshifted, using the engine to slow the car, steered into the guardrail to scrub off speed, her arms straining against the wheel as the old Honda fishtailed on the narrow mountain road. Emma screamed, and Sarah screamed back for her to hold on, to brace herself, and then they were sliding, the tires shrieking, the world spinning as the car left the road and plunged down a steep embankment, saplings and brush tearing at the metal. And Sarah fought the wheel, fought gravity, until they slammed into a large pine tree that stopped their descent with a bone-jarring crunch of crumpling metal. For a moment, there was only silence and the hiss of the broken radiator, and then Emma's crying, high and sharp with pain, and Sarah's own voice, hoarse and desperate, asking if she was okay, and the terrible discovery that Emma's right arm was bent at an angle that was absolutely wrong. The ambulance came, the local volunteer fire department, and Sarah rode with Emma to the small county hospital, her daughter's screams of pain tearing her heart apart, and it was only in the emergency room, while a doctor was setting Emma's broken arm in a cast, that the full weight of what had happened began to sink in. The sheriff arrived while Emma was being treated, a heavy-set man in his 50s named Garrett with small, suspicious eyes and a manner that immediately set Sarah's instincts screaming. He asked perfunctory questions about the accident, took notes in a small pad, and then his questions began to drift. How long had she been living in the bunker? Had she found anything unusual there? Had anyone approached her about the property? Did she know the history of previous owners? Sarah, exhausted and terrified and sitting in a hospital waiting room while doctors set her daughter's broken arm, realized with dawning horror that the sheriff was not investigating the accident, but interrogating her, treating her like a suspect rather than a victim. When she asked directly if they had found evidence of tampering, the sheriff, a heavy-set man in his 50s with cold eyes, had been evasive, saying only that mechanical failures were common in old vehicles and maybe she should have taken better care of her car. The accusation was implicit and infuriating. This was her fault, her negligence, not an attempted murder. The accident itself had happened on the winding mountain road between the bunker and town, Sarah driving carefully as always, Emma in the passenger seat chattering about a drawing she had made. When Sarah had pressed the brake pedal going into a sharp curve and felt nothing, no resistance, the pedal going straight to the floor. For one eternal second of pure terror, she had understood that they were going to crash, that the car was accelerating down the steep grade with no way to stop. The guardrail and the sheer drop beyond it rushing toward them. Training took over. She had downshifted, used the emergency brake, steered into the mountainside rather than over the edge, and they had hit a rock outcropping with a sickening crunch of metal that deployed the airbags and brought them to a violent stop. Emma had been screaming, and Sarah had tasted blood in her mouth from where she'd bitten her tongue, but they were alive, and that was all that mattered until she saw Emma's arm bent at an angle that made her stomach turn. The ambulance had taken 40 minutes to arrive. 40 minutes of Sarah holding her sobbing daughter while trying to keep her still, and at the small county hospital, they had set Emma's broken arm and admitted her overnight for observation because she had hit her head in the crash. The police had investigated, and a young deputy with kind eyes had shown Sarah the brake line under her car, the clean slice in the rubber that could not possibly be accidental, and he had promised to file a report and investigate. But then Sheriff Riggs had arrived, the same heavy-set man who had visited the bunker that first week, and his questions had been strange, focused not on who might have cut Sarah's brakes, but on what Sarah was doing at the bunker, whether she had found anything unusual, whether she had been in contact with any outsiders. Sarah, sitting at Emma's hospital bedside while her daughter slept with a cast on her small broken arm, had answered the sheriff's questions with carefully neutral responses. saying only that she was renovating the property and no, she had not noticed anything unusual, and she had watched his eyes, cold and calculating, and known with sick certainty that he was not investigating the crime but rather gathering information for whoever had ordered it. David Chen called her hospital room that evening, his voice tight with controlled fury when she told him what had happened, and he said what she had already begun to suspect: their shifting tactics. They have tried money, they have tried intimidation, and now they are moving to isolation and escalation. They cut your brake lines to send a message, to show you they can reach you anytime, but they are also setting up a narrative. Watch, Sarah, the local authorities are going to start questioning your fitness as a parent, your stability, your story about why you are living in a bunker with a child. They are going to try to take Emma away from you legally, to isolate you, to break your will while they plan something bigger, something final. The decision to send Emma away was the hardest thing Sarah had ever done, harder than burying her parents, harder than the divorce that had left her alone and struggling, harder than any moment in her military service. But as she sat in that hospital room, watching her daughter sleep with a cast on her broken arm, she knew with absolute certainty that Emma could not stay. Walter had a sister, Martha, who lived in Ohio, a widow in her 60s who had raised 4 children and now lived alone in a quiet suburb of Columbus. And when Walter called her and explained the situation in careful, coded language, she had agreed immediately to take Emma for as long as necessary. Sarah drove Emma there herself, a 7-hour journey through the mountains and into the flat farmlands of Ohio, and Emma had cried and begged not to be sent away, but Sarah had held firm, explaining that Mommy had important work to do and it was too dangerous right now, that Aunt Martha would take good care of her and it would only be for a little while. Lies that tasted like ash in her mouth because she had no idea if she would ever see her daughter again. Martha's house was warm and safe, filled with photographs of grandchildren and the smell of baking bread, and Sarah had hugged Emma so tight she worried she might hurt her, whispering promises she had no right to make, and then she had driven away with tears streaming down her face, watching in the rearview mirror as her daughter stood on the porch, waving with her good arm, growing smaller and smaller until she disappeared. The drive back to West Virginia took 8 hours because Sarah had to be certain she was not followed, taking random exits, doubling back, using every counter-surveillance technique she could remember, and it was late afternoon when she finally approached the bunker, coming up the mountain road with a sense of dread that proved entirely justified. The clearing in front of the bunker was no longer empty. It was occupied by 4 large vehicles, white SUVs with magnetic signs reading Castellane Property Management, and perhaps a dozen men in matching dark blue uniforms that looked official, but were not any police or federal agency Sarah recognized. They were private security, corporate muscle dressed up to look legitimate, and they had set up a perimeter around the bunker entrance, standing with arms crossed and expressions that were professionally neutral but carried the implicit threat of violence. Sarah stopped her car at the edge of the clearing, and before she could even step out, a man in a better suit than the others, clearly the supervisor, approached with a clipboard and what looked like legal documents. He introduced himself as Mr. Patterson, head of security for Castellane Asset Recovery LLC, and he informed her with bureaucratic politeness that she was trespassing on private property, that a court order had been issued recognizing his client's rightful ownership of this land and all structures thereon, and that she had 24 hours to remove any personal belongings before the property would be secured and access permanently denied. He handed her the court documents, and Sarah's hands shook as she read them, seeing the official seal, the legal language that meant nothing to her but looked impressively authoritative, and most damningly, the signature at the bottom, Judge Harold Markham, McDowell County Circuit Court. She took a photograph of the document with her phone and immediately sent it to David Chen, and his response came back within minutes, a single message that confirmed her worst fears. Markham has been in Apex's pocket for 20 years. The order is legal but bought. They're moving to seize the bunker. If they get inside, they'll destroy everything Victor hid. You have less than 24 hours. Sarah stood in the clearing surrounded by corporate security, holding a piece of paper that gave legal cover to theft and destruction. And she understood with perfect clarity that this was the end game, that Apex had decided the time for subtle pressure was over, that they were going to take the bunker by force, destroy the evidence, and make her disappear, and the corrupt machinery of the law would provide them cover while they did it. Sarah had 24 hours before the corporate security would force entry, 24 hours before they would seize the bunker and destroy everything. Victor had died protecting, and she spent the first 2 of those hours in a state of controlled panic, moving through the vault and the hidden spaces, checking and rechecking that she had documented everything, that David had copies of all the critical evidence, that nothing had been missed. The filing cabinet was empty now, its contents digitized and scattered across multiple secure locations, and the videotape was safely buried in the woods. But Sarah could not shake the feeling that she was missing something, that Victor, paranoid and methodical as he had been, would not have put all his faith in a single vault and a single set of documents. She sat in the cold chamber surrounded by gold that had become worthless to her, more curse than treasure, and she pulled out Victor's leather journal, reading through it again, looking for any hint, any clue she might have overlooked. The pages were worn from her repeated readings, the precise handwriting as familiar now as her own, and she was about to close it in frustration when her fingers felt something odd, a slight thickness to the back cover that did not match the front. She ran her hand over the leather, pressing gently, and felt a rigidity that was not just the binding, something hard and flat hidden within the cover itself. Her heart began to race as she took out her pocket knife and carefully sliced along the inner seam of the back cover, peeling away the leather lining to reveal a thin pocket that had been sewn into the binding, invisible unless you knew to look for it. Inside was a small, rectangular object wrapped in protective plastic, a strip of microfilm, the kind used for document preservation before the digital age, perhaps 2 inches long and half an inch wide, containing dozens of tiny photographic frames that would need a specialized reader to view. Sarah had seen microfilm in libraries during her college years, knew it could contain extraordinary amounts of information compressed into a nearly indestructible format, and she understood immediately that this was Victor's final insurance, the evidence so damaging he had hidden it separate from everything else, trusting that if someone found his journal and understood its importance, they would search carefully enough to discover this last secret. She drove through the night to the nearest university library that was open 24 hours, a 2-hour journey to West Virginia University in Morgantown, and in the basement archives room, she found an old microfilm reader, a boxy machine with a viewing screen that hummed when she turned it on. She threaded the strip of film through the mechanism with shaking hands, and as the images appeared on the screen, magnified and clear, she felt her breath stop in her chest. The first frames were photographs, surveillance shots taken with a telephoto lens in December of 1981, and they showed a man Sarah recognized from news articles and corporate websites, Richard Drummond, current CEO of Castellane Asset Recovery LLC and former executive vice president of Apex International, though in these photographs he was 40 years younger, his hair dark instead of silver, but his face unmistakable. He was at the bunker, standing in the clearing where Sarah now parked her car, and in one shot he was talking to 2 other men, hard-faced individuals who radiated violence, and in another shot, impossibly, he was standing inside the vault itself, his hand resting on the gold bars, his expression one of cold fury. The next frames were documents, internal Apex memorandums with Drummond's signature authorizing a permanent solution to the Castellane problem. A contract with a private security firm for executive protection and asset recovery services dated 1 week before Victor disappeared, and a bank transfer of $200,000 to an offshore account with a notation that made Sarah's blood run cold. Final payment for West Virginia operation. The last frame was a handwritten note from Victor, dated the 14th of December 1981, 1 day before his final journal entry, and it read in his precise script, "Drummond came today. He found the bunker. I do not know how, but he was here, in the vault, and he saw the gold. He did not see the documents, did not find the filing cabinet, but he knows I have taken their treasure." He smiled at me, and it was the smile of a man who has already decided you are dead. If I disappear, if this journal is found and I am gone, know this with absolute certainty. Richard Drummond ordered my death. He was here. He knows about the gold. He is the architect of everything. Sarah called David Chen from the university library at 3 in the morning, her voice shaking as she described what she had found on the microfilm, the photographs of Drummond at the bunker, the documentary proof that the current CEO of the corporation hunting her had personally ordered Victor's murder 40 years ago, and David's response was immediate and decisive. It was time to bring in federal law enforcement, but not just any agent, someone specific, someone he had been cultivating as a source for years, someone he trusted with his life. FBI Special Agent Lisa Torres worked out of the Charleston field office, and David had been dealing with her for the better part of a decade, watching her turn down promotions that would have required political compromise, watching her pursue cases against powerful targets that other agents avoided, and he believed, as much as he could believe anything in a world where trust was a dangerous luxury, that she was clean. David made the call himself, using his credentials as a journalist to request an urgent meeting, and 6 hours later, Sarah found herself sitting in a small, windowless conference room in the federal building in Charleston, facing a woman who radiated competence and barely suppressed intensity. Agent Torres was in her early 40s, Latina, with dark hair pulled back in a severe bun, wearing a crisp white shirt and dark pants, no jewelry except a simple watch, and eyes that missed absolutely nothing as they studied Sarah with an assessment that felt like being examined under a microscope. David had brought copies of selected documents, enough to prove the scope of what they had, but not so much that they would compromise the full cash if this meeting went wrong, and he laid them on the table between them. Pages from Victor's ledger showing bribes to federal officials, photographs of Apex executives meeting with known criminals, and finally, printed frames from the microfilm showing Richard Drummond at the bunker in 1981. Agent Torres read in silence, her expression neutral, professional, giving nothing away, but Sarah saw the slight tremor in her hands as she turned pages, the way her jaw tightened when she reached the photographs of Drummond, and when she finally looked up after 20 minutes of intense study, her eyes were blazing with something that looked like vindication mixed with barely controlled rage. She said in a voice that was carefully controlled that she had been investigating fragments of this for 3 years, ever since a confidential informant had come to her with stories about Apex and its successor corporations, stories about money laundering and political corruption that she had not been able to prove because the informant had disappeared before providing solid evidence, and every lead she had followed had hit walls of corporate lawyers and jurisdictional challenges and pressure from above to drop it. What Sarah and David had just shown her was not fragments. It was a complete case, the kind of evidence that prosecutors dreamed about, a RICO case that could bring down an entire criminal enterprise and everyone connected to it. She leaned forward, her intensity focused like a laser, and she said that this was RICO charges for racketeering, conspiracy to commit murder going back 40 years, money laundering, illegal arms trafficking, bribery of federal officials, and if they could prove even half of what these documents suggested, they could seize assets, dissolve corporations, and send people to prison for the rest of their lives. But, and her voice dropped to something grimmer, she needed the physical evidence, needed the original documents and the Gold and Victor's videotape, because defense attorneys would challenge digital copies, would claim fabrication and manipulation, and juries needed to see original evidence to believe in conspiracy on this scale. She could get warrants, could mobilize a federal response team, but the process would take time, at least 48 hours to go through proper channels, to brief the U.S. attorney, to get a federal judge to sign off on warrants, and Sarah interrupted, her voice breaking with desperation, to say they did not have 48 hours. They had less than 18 now before corporate security seized the bunker under a corrupt local court order, and if Apex got inside first, they would destroy everything, and it would all be over. The 24 hours expired at 4 in the afternoon, and Sarah stood alone in front of the bunker entrance, her car packed with her few belongings but going nowhere, because Agent Torres had made it clear that if she abandoned the bunker, if she let them take possession, any evidence they destroyed would be inadmissible, the chain of custody broken, and 40 years of Victor's desperate preservation would be for nothing. The corporate security had withdrawn to the perimeter of the clearing at dawn, waiting with professional patience for the deadline, and now Sarah heard the convoy before she saw it, heavy trucks grinding up the mountain road, and when they emerged from the tree line, her stomach dropped. Margaret Thorne's Mercedes led the procession, followed by 3 large trucks bearing equipment, and perhaps 20 workers in hard hats and safety vests. And bringing up the rear was a vehicle that made Sarah's blood run cold, a demolition truck with a hydraulic arm and wrecking ball. Margaret emerged from her car looking triumphant, flanked by Mr. People, Patterson, and his security team, and she approached Sarah with a clipboard and that same cold smile, announcing in a voice loud enough for all the workers to hear that she was here under court order to secure an unstable structure that posed a danger to public safety, and that Miss Martinez had been given ample opportunity to vacate and had chosen to remain in contempt of a lawful order. Sarah stood her ground, her phone in her hand, and she said in a voice that was surprisingly steady that she was not leaving, that this was her legal property. and that Margaret's court order was obtained through corruption and would not stand up to federal scrutiny. Margaret's smile widened, and she gestured to the demolition crew, saying that Miss Martinez's legal theories could be discussed later, but right now the bunker was going to be sealed for public safety, and if Sarah did not move, she would be physically removed and charged with obstruction. The security team began to advance, and Sarah pressed the speed dial on her phone, and David Chen answered on the first ring, and she said the single word they had agreed upon. Now, what happened next was something Margaret Thorne had clearly not anticipated. 3 news vans, one from Charleston, one from a regional network, and one from a national cable news service, came roaring up the mountain road with a speed that suggested they had been staged nearby, waiting for the call. Cameramen and reporters spilled out, and suddenly the clearing was full of people with cameras and microphones, and Sarah, following the script she and David had rehearsed, walked directly to the nearest reporter and said in a clear, loud voice that she was the legal owner of this property, that she had discovered evidence of corporate crime hidden here by a murdered whistleblower, and that Apex International's successor corporation was trying to seize the property illegally to destroy that evidence. The reporters, smelling blood in the water, turned their cameras and microphones toward Margaret Thorne, and she stood frozen, her face a mask of barely controlled fury, as questions were shouted at her. What evidence? What crime? Why was a demolition crew here? The standoff had become public, broadcast live on 2 channels, and Margaret understood immediately that she could not proceed, that bulldozing a bunker on camera while a woman claimed it contained evidence of murder would be a public relations catastrophe that even Apex's resources could not spin. She called off the demolition crew with a sharp gesture, but she walked directly up to Sarah, close enough that the cameras could not hear, and she said in a voice like poisoned honey, "This isn't over. You have made this public, which means we respond publicly. We will bury you in litigation. We will sue you for defamation, for trespassing, for theft, for every single thing our lawyers can think of. We will tie you up in court for years until you have nothing left. Not money, not this property, not even your daughter. You just chose to fight, so now we fight, and we never lose." The legal assault began within hours of the standoff. Papers served by process servers who seemed to materialize from nowhere, lawsuit after lawsuit filing in rapid succession. Castellane Asset Recovery LLC was suing Sarah for defamation, claiming her public statements had damaged their corporate reputation. They were suing for theft of property, claiming the gold belonged to them. They were filing motions to have her declared mentally incompetent and Emma removed from her custody. They were seeking restraining orders and injunctions and a dozen other legal maneuvers that David Chen warned would take months to untangle, even with the best lawyers. Agent Torres was working on the federal warrants, but the bureaucratic machinery moved slowly, requiring approvals from supervisors and prosecutors and judges. And in the meantime, Sarah was trapped in a legal quagmire, unable to leave the bunker for fear it would be seized, unable to bring Emma back because Child Services had opened an investigation, living on supplies that Walter brought her, while reporters camped at the base of the mountain waiting for developments. It was during one of these long, desperate nights, Sarah alone in the bunker with only Victor's journal for company, that she read the entries she had skimmed before. The personal reflections from 1979 before Victor had discovered Apex's crimes, and she found passages she had not fully absorbed in her earlier readings. Victor wrote about his past, about a woman he had loved in college, a relationship that had ended badly when he had been young and foolish and afraid of commitment, and how he had learned years later that she had been pregnant when they split, that she had given birth to a daughter in 1978, a daughter he had never met because the mother, hurt and angry, had refused all contact. Victor had written the woman's name, Rebecca Castellane, his own surname, suggesting she had perhaps never married, and he had noted that she was living in Charleston, West Virginia, working as a nurse, trying to raise his daughter alone while he had climbed the corporate ladder in New York and pretended he had no ties, no responsibilities. The guilt in his words was profound, made worse by the knowledge that by stealing the gold and becoming a target, he had made it impossible to ever reach out, to ever try to be the father he should have been, because contact would only put them in danger. The final entry about his daughter, dated November 1981, read, "Rebecca wrote to me last month. She is sick, something with her lungs, and she wanted me to know about our daughter, to ask if I would take responsibility if something happened to her. I cannot respond. Any contact traces back to them. But I have added a codicil to the deed, hidden in the county records under my legal name. If I die, if this property ever goes to legal auction, my daughter Claire is the rightful heir. She is 3 years old now. If you are reading this, if you have found my secrets, please find her. Tell her I am sorry. Tell her the gold is blood money, but the truth is clean. Give her both. Sarah sat in the cold darkness, her mind racing through the implications, and she pulled out her phone and searched public records, genealogy databases, anything she could access. And she found her, Claire Castellane, born in Charleston in 1978, now 47 years old, and according to her LinkedIn profile, a civil rights attorney in Washington, D.C., specializing in corporate accountability and whistleblower protection. And Sarah felt the hairs on her arms stand up because Victor's daughter had grown up to fight the same battles he had died fighting. And if Claire was Victor's legal heir, if the property had been meant for her, then every lawsuit Apex had filed was built on a foundation of lies, because they were not just trying to silence Sarah, they were trying to steal from a dead man's daughter. Agent Torres arrived at dawn on the 8th day of the siege with a convoy that made Margaret Thorne's demolition crew look like a children's parade. 6 black SUVs, 2 armored evidence trucks, and 20 federal agents in full tactical gear, all backed by warrants signed by a federal judge that superseded every corrupt local order Apex had purchased. Sarah stood at the bunker entrance and watched them secure the perimeter, watched Torres personally take possession of the vault and its contents, watched the gold bars being photographed and catalogued and loaded into evidence containers with a precision that spoke of cases being built that would stand up in any courtroom in America. At the exact same moment, coordinated down to the minute, David Chen's article went live on the front page of his newspaper's website and in print editions across the country. The Bunker's Secret: How a Single Mother Uncovered 40 Years of Corporate Murder and Corruption. The story had everything: Victor's videotape, the photographs of Richard Drummond at the crime scene, the ledger of bribes, the list of murdered witnesses, and most damning, the microfilm proving that Apex's current CEO had personally ordered a murder and built an empire on blood money. By noon, the story had gone viral, trending on every social media platform, picked up by every major news network, and Sarah watched on Walters Television as FBI agents led Richard Drummond out of his Connecticut mansion in handcuffs, as Margaret Thorne was arrested at her office, as Apex's stock price collapsed and federal prosecutors announced RICO charges against 17 executives and the dissolution of multiple subsidiary corporations. Walter had driven to Ohio and brought Emma back, and Sarah held her daughter while they watched justice finally, impossibly arrive, and she thought of Victor Castellane, of his haunted eyes on that videotape, and she whispered to his ghost that it was finished, that he could rest now, that the truth had survived. 6 months after the arrests, Sarah sat in the living room of a real house, not a bunker but an actual home, with windows that let in sunlight and a yard where Emma could play. Purchased with a portion of the substantial finder's fee the federal government had offered her for recovering evidence in what prosecutors were calling the largest RICO case in decades. The gold had been seized as proceeds from crime, destined to be liquidated and distributed to victims of Apex's crimes. But Sarah had been awarded 10% of its value for her role in exposing the conspiracy. Enough money that she would never have to worry about medical bills or rent again. More valuable than the money, though, was the woman sitting across from her, Claire Castellane, 47 years old. A civil rights attorney with her father's precise mind and his deep commitment to justice, who had wept when Sarah showed her Victor's journal and the passages about his regret, about how he had wanted to protect her by staying away. Together, they had established the Victor Castellane Foundation, using Sarah's finder's fee and donations that had poured in after David Chen's articles, dedicated to supporting whistleblowers and fighting corporate corruption, giving Victor's blood money a purpose that would have made him proud. Emma was thriving, her nightmares gone, and she told Sarah one morning that the sad man had visited her one last time, not frightening but peaceful, and he had smiled and waved goodbye, his eyes finally at rest. The bunker remained on the mountain, sealed now as a federal evidence site, and sometimes Sarah would drive up there and stand in the clearing, looking at the concrete entrance, and she would think about how she had bought it for $1 seeking only shelter, and had found instead a purpose, a fight worth fighting, and the truth that some treasures cannot be measured in gold, but only in the courage to protect what matters, no matter the cost.